A marriage mistake bound the Omega to the wrong Alpha, and the law refused to let go again. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let's return to our main character. Elena Hart stood beneath the pale glow of the ceremonial lanterns, her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her fingers had gone numb. The stone floor beneath her shoes cool and unyielding as the night air drifted through the open hall, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. And although the gathering was meant to be a celebration of unity, nothing about the silence felt joyful, because every breath she took felt borrowed, every second stretching as if time itself were holding its breath with her, waiting for a truth no one wanted to name aloud, especially not the Omega who stood at the center of it all. Elena had been told this marriage was necessary, that it would stabilize borders and calm old tensions, that her role was simple and honorable. Yet as the officiant's voice echoed through the chamber, reading words older than any living pack member, she felt the unmistakable weight of something going wrong, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a compass needle turning the wrong way without anyone noticing. Marcus Hale stood a few feet away, tall and composed, his expression controlled to the point of distance, and Elena searched his face for reassurance, for recognition, for anything that suggested this bond meant the same thing to him that it meant to her life. But his gaze passed over her, as if she were another obligation already checked off a list, and that was when the unease settled deep in her chest, heavy and persistent. The law was clear, everyone knew that. Once the oath was spoken and the mark recorded, the bond was recognized by the council and protected by tradition, and Elena had grown up hearing stories of how such laws preserved order, how they prevented chaos, yet standing there, listening to her name paired with the wrong Alpha, she realized laws did not ask how a heart felt, they did not pause for doubt, they simply moved forward, efficient and irreversible. When the final words were spoken and the ceremonial stone recorded the union, a soft murmur rippled through the room, subtle enough that only those listening closely would hear it, a hesitation, a collective sense that something had shifted just out of alignment, and Elena felt it too, a faint tightening in her chest that was not pain but was not peace either. As if a door had closed somewhere inside her before she had the chance to see what lay beyond it. She wanted to speak, to ask a question, to slow the moment down by even a heartbeat, but years of being taught her place held her still, and so she stood there as the law sealed her fate, bound not by choice or affection but by procedure, and in that quiet space between ceremony and consequence, Elena Hart understood that this was only the beginning, because mistakes made under the law did not simply fade away. They waited, patient and unyielding, until the cost came due. Morning came quietly to Marcus Hale's territory, the sun climbing over the eastern ridge as if nothing irreversible had happened the night before. Yet Elena felt the difference in her body before she ever opened her eyes, a subtle pressure beneath her ribs that had not been there before, not pain, not fear, but a constant awareness that reminded her she was no longer entirely her own. The guest chamber assigned to her was large and carefully prepared, but it did not feel like hers. Every piece of furniture placed with precision, every surface untouched, as if she were expected to pass through rather than remain. When she rose and crossed the room, the floorboards cool beneath her bare feet. She paused by the window and looked out over the rolling land that now defined her future, acres of forest and stone paths stretching for miles, beautiful in a distant, impersonal way, like a painting she had been told to admire without ever touching. Servants greeted her politely in the corridor, their bows respectful yet restrained, and Elena sensed the unspoken question in their eyes, not cruelty, just curiosity, because everyone knew she had not been chosen in the way Omegas dreamed of being chosen. She had been assigned, and there was a difference the world never failed to notice. Marcus did not join her for the morning meal. Instead, a message arrived, delivered with formal courtesy, explaining that he had council matters to attend to and would see her later, a phrase so vague it offered no comfort. And as Elena sat alone at the long table, The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. She tried to eat, but every bite felt heavy, and the awareness in her chest tightened whenever she thought about the words spoken during the ceremony, about how easily her name had been bound to his without pause or correction. Later that morning, she was escorted through the halls, shown the spaces she was permitted to use, the gardens she could walk in, the rooms that were off limits. Each boundary explained calmly, politely, as if this were not her life, but a set of visiting rules she was expected to memorize. Elena nodded and thanked them, because that was what she had always done, learned to do. But inside, something quiet and stubborn began to resist, a realization that obedience had brought her here and would keep her here unless she found the courage to question it. When Marcus finally appeared in the late afternoon, he looked as composed as ever, his presence controlled and deliberate, and he spoke to her with courtesy, acknowledging the union, explaining expectations, outlining responsibilities, his tone measured and distant, like a man addressing a role rather than a person, and Elena listened because she had been trained to listen, but she could not ignore how the bond between them felt thin, stretched, as if it connected 2 points that did not naturally align. As he spoke, the pressure in her chest shifted, not toward him, but away, tugging gently at something she could not see, and for the first time, Elena wondered if the law that had bound her had made a mistake deeper than a name written wrong on parchment, a mistake that could not be corrected by silence or patience. That night, as the temperature dropped into the low 50s and the halls grew quiet, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aware of every breath she took. Every heartbeat steady but unsettled, and she realized with a clarity that surprised her that this life, this bond, this careful arrangement, might obey the law perfectly while still betraying the truth of who she was meant to stand beside, and somewhere beyond the walls of Marcus Hale's territory, a future she had not chosen yet seemed to be waiting, just out of reach, refusing to be forgotten. The discovery did not arrive as a dramatic announcement or a raised voice in a crowded hall. It came quietly, the way truth often did, folded into routine and overlooked by those who believed everything was already settled. And Elena found it on the third day, in a room she had been told was rarely used, a records chamber tucked behind the eastern wing, where sunlight filtered through tall windows and dust drifted slowly through the air. She had gone there because she could not sleep, because the pressure in her chest grew stronger whenever she lay still, and because walking helped her think, even if she was not sure what she was searching for. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with ledgers bound in dark leather, each one labeled with dates and seals, and as Elena traced her fingers along the spines, she felt an unexpected pull, subtle but insistent, guiding her to a single book that seemed warmer than the rest, as if it had been handled more recently. Moment when correction was no longer allowed. Elena closed the book and leaned against the shelf, steadying herself as the pressure in her chest shifted, sharp for a moment before easing into something colder and clearer, and she understood then why the bond felt wrong, why it pulled her nowhere instead of anchoring her, why standing beside Marcus felt like standing in someone else's shadow. Later that afternoon, she asked careful questions, nothing accusatory, nothing direct, and the answers she received were polite but evasive, explanations that circled around the truth without touching it, because no one wanted to admit that the law, ancient and revered, could fail so quietly. When she finally spoke to Marcus, choosing her words with care, she mentioned the registry, the sigil, the discrepancy, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure cracked, not dramatically, but just enough for her to see the tension beneath, the knowledge he had been carrying alone. He did not deny it. Instead, he confirmed what she already knew, that the mistake had been noticed almost immediately, that the council had reviewed it in private, that the conclusion had been unanimous and final. The bond stood, regardless of error, because undoing it would invite instability, questions, and consequences no one was willing to face. Elena listened, her hands folded in her lap, her posture calm even as something inside her hardened, because hearing it spoken aloud made the truth unavoidable. She was not bound by destiny or choice, but by convenience, by fear of disruption, by a law that valued order over individuals. That night, As she returned to her chamber and the temperature dropped again into the low 50s, she stood by the window and looked out across the land, realizing that the mistake was no longer the binding itself, but the assumption that she would accept it in silence. And somewhere far beyond Marcus Hale's walls, the bond within her shifted once more, not toward what held her, but toward what had been denied, as if the future, patient and watchful, had finally taken notice. The council chamber was colder than Elena expected, not in temperature but in tone, the kind of cold that came from certainty rather than cruelty. And as she stood before the long table of elders, she understood that this meeting was not meant to ask what she wanted, only to inform her of what would remain unchanged. The windows were tall and narrow, letting in strips of afternoon light that fell across carved wood and polished stone, and the elders sat evenly spaced, their expressions calm, composed, and already decided. Elena listened as the chief arbiter spoke, his voice steady and practiced, explaining that the ceremonial law was older than any single pact, older than written borders, and that its purpose had always been preservation, not perfection. He acknowledged the error without hesitation, naming it plainly as a misrecorded sigil, a mistake made during a legally sanctioned rite, and with that admission, a strange quiet settled in the room, because everyone present understood the weight of what followed. Once the bond had been sealed and recognized by the registry, it became immutable, not because the law was blind, but because reversing it would undermine every union that relied on the same authority, and the council would not risk unraveling centuries of order for a single correction, no matter how justified it might seem on a personal level. Elena felt the pressure in her chest tighten as those words landed, the same sensation she had carried since the ceremony, now given form and explanation, and she realized that the law did not see her as an individual caught in an error, but as a variable in a system that demanded stability above all else. She spoke once, calmly and clearly, asking whether intention mattered, whether consent weighed anything against procedure, and the answer she received was gentle but unyielding. Intention guided the law, but it did not override it, and consent had been presumed by participation in the rite itself. Marcus stood to her left throughout the exchange, silent, his posture respectful, and when the final declaration was made, confirming that the bond would stand and all records would remain unchanged, he inclined his head in acceptance, as if this outcome had never been in doubt. Elena followed him out of the chamber afterward, her steps measured, her expression composed, because years of being in Omega had taught her how to carry disappointment without showing it. Yet something inside her had shifted permanently, not breaking, but hardening into resolve. In the days that followed, the ruling spread quietly through the territory, carried in lowered voices and careful glances, and Elena felt the change in how she was treated, no longer a guest or a newly bound partner, but a settled fact, a conclusion everyone expected her to adapt to without further disturbance. Duties were assigned, appearances scheduled, expectations clarified, and each instruction was delivered with courtesy, as if kindness could soften inevitability. But at night, when the halls grew quiet and the temperature dipped into the low 40s, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aware of the bond's presence like a constant hum beneath her thoughts, persistent and misaligned. She began to understand that the law's refusal to release her was not born of malice, but of fear of change, fear of precedent, fear of admitting that even the oldest systems could be wrong, and with that understanding came a deeper realization that obedience had always been expected from her, but belief had not. Standing at the window one evening, watching the last light fade over Marcus Hale's land, Elena placed a hand over her chest and acknowledged the truth she could no longer ignore. The law had bound her body and her name, but it had not claimed her spirit, and whatever future awaited her beyond this ruling would not be found in silence. Life beside Marcus Hale settled into a rhythm that looked stable from the outside and felt hollow from within, a routine measured by scheduled appearances, shared meals attended more out of obligation than connection, and long stretches of silence where words felt unnecessary because nothing meaningful would change them. Elena learned the territory quickly, the winding paths through the gardens, the stone corridors that carried sound farther than expected, the way the light shifted across the main hall in the late afternoon, and she performed her role with quiet competence, offering courtesy where it was expected and restraint where it was required. To those watching, she appeared composed, even fortunate, an omega bound to a powerful alpha with resources, land, and security, yet each day reinforced the same truth she could not escape. The bond between them did not deepen. It merely persisted, present but distant, like a line drawn on a map that connected two places without reflecting the ground between them. Marcus treated her with consistent respect, never raising his voice, never issuing commands without explanation. But there was no warmth beneath his attention, no instinctive pull that mirrored the constant awareness in her chest, and Elena found herself measuring time. Not by hours or days, but by the moments when the bond tightened unexpectedly, a reminder of something unresolved rather than fulfilled. Nights were the hardest, when the halls quieted and the temperature dropped into the high 30s, and Elena lay awake listening to the distant creak of the old structure, aware of Marcus in another wing of the residence, close enough to sense through the bond, yet impossibly far, in every way that mattered. She began to notice patterns, how the bond reacted more strongly when she was alone, how it seemed to search rather than settle, and although she did not understand why, the sensation carried a strange consistency, as if her body recognized an absence more than a presence. During public gatherings, Marcus stood at her side as required, their movements coordinated by expectation rather than instinct, and Elena felt the contrast sharply when others addressed them, congratulating them on their union, speaking of harmony and strength, unaware that what held them together was not alignment but enforcement. Over time, Elena stopped correcting the assumptions, not because she agreed with them, but because she was conserving something, energy, resolve, the quiet strength that had grown since the council ruling, and she realized that survival here did not mean acceptance, it meant patience. One afternoon, while walking the outer path near the eastern ridge, she paused, overcome by a sudden tightening in her chest that was stronger than anything she had felt before, not painful, but urgent, and for a brief moment, the land around her seemed to recede, her focus narrowing to a single, inexplicable certainty that something beyond these borders was shifting. The sensation faded as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless and unsettled, and when she returned to the residence, she said nothing, carrying the experience with her like a secret she was not yet ready to name. That evening, Marcus spoke of upcoming obligations, a visit from neighboring representatives, discussions that would require her presence, and Elena listened, nodding when appropriate, her expression calm, even as the bond hummed quietly beneath the surface, unchanged by proximity, unmoved by intention. As she prepared for rest that night, standing before the mirror in the soft lamplight, Elena studied her reflection and recognized the woman she had become since the ceremony, still restrained, still composed, but no longer uncertain of herself, and she understood then that living beside the wrong alpha was not breaking her, it was clarifying her, sharpening her awareness of what the law could demand and what it could never truly command. Somewhere beyond Marcus Hale's territory, beyond the reach of rulings and registries, the future she had felt stirring before seemed to draw closer, not in defiance, but in quiet insistence, and Elena Hart resolved that when it finally arrived, she would be ready to stand in it, regardless of what the law refused to release. The announcement of the Alpha King's arrival did not come with fanfare. Only a formal notice delivered one quiet morning, sealed and precise, informing Marcus Hale that Rowan Blackwood would be crossing into the territory within 48 hours to conduct a review of recent ceremonial records, and when Elena heard the name spoken aloud, the pressure in her chest surged so suddenly that she had to steady herself against the back of a chair, her breath catching in a way she could not explain. She had heard of Rowan Blackwood before. Everyone had. Stories carried carefully between packs about a ruler who did not rely on spectacle, whose authority was felt rather than displayed, and yet none of those stories prepared her for the reaction that rippled through her the moment his presence became imminent. Over the next 2 days, the territory shifted subtly, preparations made with quiet efficiency, halls cleaned, schedules adjusted, and Marcus grew more reserved than usual, his attention divided between duty and anticipation, though he spoke little of it. Elena moved through those days with heightened awareness, every sound sharper, every thought circling back to the same inexplicable pull, And when the Alpha King finally arrived just after noon on the third day, the world seemed to narrow to the sound of approaching footsteps echoing through the main hall. Rowan Blackwood entered without pause, tall and composed, his presence calm yet unmistakable, and as Elena lifted her gaze to meet his for the first time, the bond within her reacted with startling clarity, tightening not with discomfort, but with recognition so profound it left her momentarily disoriented. It was not attraction in any shallow sense, not a rush of emotion she could easily name, but a deep alignment, as if something long held out of place had finally been acknowledged, and she realized in that instant that this was what had been missing all along. Rowan's expression did not change when their eyes met, but something in his focus sharpened, his attention settling on her with deliberate stillness, and Elena felt seen in a way she never had before, not as a role or a responsibility, but as a person standing at the center of a complicated truth. The meeting that followed was formal, records reviewed, questions asked with careful precision, and Elena remained present as required, though her thoughts struggled to keep pace with the steady undercurrent building inside her. Each time Rowan spoke, the awareness in her chest responded, steady and certain, and she understood with growing clarity that the bond she carried had not been wrong in the sense the council believed. It had been misdirected, forced to attach where it could rather than where it belonged. At one point, Rowan paused mid-sentence, his gaze flicking briefly toward her before returning to the registry, and in that fleeting moment, Elena sensed his realization forming alongside her own. When the session concluded and Marcus stepped away to attend to administrative matters, Rowan approached Elena with respectful distance, his voice low, and even as he addressed her directly for the first time, asking how she had been since the ceremony. A simple question that carried more weight than any declaration. Elena answered honestly, measured and composed, yet as their brief exchange ended, the connection between them remained, quiet but undeniable, like a current beneath still water. That evening, alone once more in her chamber as the temperature dipped into the low 40s, Elena pressed a hand over her chest and felt the bond settle into something unmistakable, no longer searching blindly, but orienting itself with calm certainty, and she knew without doubt that destiny had finally stepped into the room, not with force or defiance, but with undeniable truth, and nothing, not law nor fear nor precedent, would be able to unmake what had just been recognized. The tension between what was written and what was felt became impossible to ignore in the days following Rowan Blackwood's arrival, because once recognition had occurred, it did not fade back into silence. It remained, steady and present, shaping every moment Elena moved through the halls of Marcus Hale's territory. She felt it when she woke each morning, a calm certainty beneath her ribs that contrasted sharply with the rigid structure surrounding her, and she felt it again whenever Rowan was near, the bond responding not with urgency or longing, but with alignment, as if it had finally been given direction. Rowan did not seek her out openly, nor did he make declarations that would have drawn attention or suspicion, but his awareness of her was constant, careful, and unmistakable, and Elena sensed that he was weighing something far larger than personal desire. The review of records continued, conducted with precision and restraint, and Elena observed from the edges as Rowan examined the ceremonial laws with an attention that went beyond procedure, his questions probing the spaces others avoided, the assumptions long left unchallenged. Marcus remained present throughout, his demeanor controlled, though Elena could feel the strain beneath it, the awareness that the ground beneath their arrangement was no longer as stable as it once appeared. One afternoon, Elena found herself walking beside Rowan through the outer garden path, the conversation measured and neutral on the surface, yet charged with unspoken understanding. And when he finally addressed the bond directly, his voice was quiet, his words chosen with care. He did not ask what she felt, because he already knew. He asked whether she understood what acknowledging it would mean. Elena answered without hesitation, saying that she understood the consequences, the disruption, the risk, because she had been living with them since the ceremony, and the honesty of her response settled something between them, not easing the tension, but clarifying it. Rowan spoke then of the law, not dismissively, but with respect, explaining that it existed to protect, yet had been shaped by fear of chaos rather than faith in truth, and that challenging it would require more than authority. it would require willingness to face the cost of change. Elena listened, her posture steady, her expression calm, because for the first time, the conflict was no longer internal. It was named, acknowledged, shared, and that alone shifted its weight. Later that evening, the council convened again, this time with Rowan present, and the atmosphere was markedly different, not hostile, but charged with anticipation, because the Alpha King's involvement transformed what had been a closed matter into a question of precedent and principle. Rowan did not accuse, nor did he demand. He presented the facts clearly, the misbinding, the misalignment, the consequences of enforcing a bond that contradicted its own purpose, and he asked the council to consider whether preserving order at the expense of truth truly served the future they claimed to protect. Elena stood beside him, not as a challenge, but as evidence, her presence a reminder that laws did not exist in abstraction. They lived within people, shaped lives, constrained possibilities. Marcus listened in silence, his expression unreadable, and when the discussion concluded without resolution, Elena understood that the law would not yield easily, because systems rarely did. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The question was no longer whether the bond was correct, but whether the law was willing to confront its own limits. That night, as Elena returned to her chamber and the temperature dipped into the mid-40s, she stood by the window once more, aware of the bond within her, no longer strained or searching, but anchored in quiet certainty. And she realized that destiny was not a force that demanded obedience. It was a truth that waited to be chosen, even when the cost was high. And for the first time since the ceremony, Elena felt prepared to choose it, regardless of what the law refused to release. The choice did not arrive in a moment of spectacle, but in a quiet request delivered to Elena the following morning, an invitation from the council asking her to speak again, this time not as an observer or a subject of review, but as the one whose life carried the weight of their deliberation. She stood in the same chamber as before, the light slanting through the narrow windows, the air steady and expectant, and she felt the bond within her settle into calm resolve, no longer pulling or resisting, simply present, as if it trusted her to speak. Rowan Blackwood stood a respectful distance behind her, not guiding, not prompting, his presence steady without being imposing, and Marcus Hale remained to her other side, silent, composed, yet visibly aware that this moment was no longer governed solely by law or protocol. When the chief arbiter addressed her directly, asking whether she wished to submit a statement for the record, Elena did not hesitate, because the weeks of silence, adjustment, and internal reckoning had led her here with clarity she could no longer deny. She spoke calmly, her voice steady, explaining that she had honored the law because she believed in order and responsibility, but that living within a bond that contradicted its own purpose had shown her the difference between stability and truth, and she reminded them that the law had been created to protect connection, not enforce absence. The chamber remained quiet as she continued, describing what it meant to wake each day aligned with obligation but disconnected from meaning, to fulfill every expectation while knowing the bond itself remained incomplete, not broken, but misplaced, and she stated plainly that she accepted the consequences of challenging the ruling, whatever they might be, because continuing as they were would be a slower, quieter form of loss. When she finished, no one spoke immediately, the silence stretching as the council absorbed not her defiance, but her composure, and Elena understood that this was the moment the law feared most, not rebellion, but clarity. Rowan stepped forward then, his voice measured and even, declaring that he would formally acknowledge the bond as he recognized it, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of responsibility, stating that leadership required the courage to confront when systems failed the very people they were meant to serve, and that he would accept any consequences the council deemed necessary for doing so. The room shifted at that declaration, the weight of precedent pressing against the possibility of change, and Marcus finally spoke, his tone controlled, acknowledging that while the law bound Elena to him, it had never granted him her alignment, and that enforcing a bond without it had revealed the limitation of authority when divorced from purpose. The council withdrew briefly, deliberating behind closed doors, and Elena waited, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, aware that whatever followed would redefine her future. When the elders returned, Their ruling was careful and conditional, not a full dissolution, but a suspension of enforcement, a recognition that the bond's validity required further examination under revised authority, and while it was not freedom in the absolute sense, it was movement, the first shift the law had allowed since the ceremony. As the chamber emptied and the temperature outside hovered in the low 50s, Elena stepped into the corridor, feeling lighter not because everything was resolved, but because she had finally spoken for herself, and as Rowan walked beside her in silence, she realized that choosing destiny was not about rejecting the law entirely, but about insisting that it grow, and, for the first time since the night of the binding, Elena Hart felt the future open not as an escape, but as a path she had chosen to stand on. The days that followed did not bring immediate resolution, but they brought something rarer, a sense of forward motion that Elena could feel with every breath she took, as if the world itself had shifted just enough to acknowledge her choice. The council's suspension altered the atmosphere of Marcus Hale's territory in subtle ways. Conversations quieter, assumptions less certain, and while the law had not released her entirely, it had loosened its grip, allowing space for truth to breathe. Marcus approached her one evening as the sky darkened into deep blue and the temperature hovered in the low 40s, his demeanor measured yet sincere, and he spoke without defensiveness, acknowledging that their bond had been defined more by expectation than connection, and that releasing control, even partially, was the only honorable response left to him. Elena listened, offering him respect without pretense, because understanding did not require bitterness, only honesty, and in that exchange, the final tension between them eased into something neutral and quiet. Rowan Blackwood remained present throughout those days, never pressing, never demanding, his support expressed through consistency rather than words, and Elena came to understand that leadership, when done well, did not rush outcomes, it prepared space for them. When they walked together along the outer path at dusk, the land stretching wide and still around them, Elena felt the bond settle with peaceful certainty, no longer something she questioned, but something she accepted as part of herself, aligned and steady. Rowan spoke then of the future, not in promises, but in possibilities, of reforms the council would need to consider, of traditions that could evolve without breaking, and of the responsibility that came with being seen, truly seen, by a system that had long overlooked individual truth. Elena realized that what she had gained was not simply the chance for a different bond, but the recognition that her voice mattered within the structures that shaped her life. As preparations were made for Rowan's departure, the territory returned to its routines, but Elena moved through them differently now, her posture lighter, her awareness grounded, and when she stood at the window one final evening, watching the last light fade across the hills, she reflected on how far she had come from the night of the binding, from the silence she had carried for so long. The law still stood, formidable and slow to change, but it had been challenged, not through force, but through clarity and choice, and that alone marked a turning point that could not be undone. When Rowan prepared to leave the following morning, he paused before her, his expression calm and resolute, and he told her that whatever path lay ahead would be one they would navigate with care, not because destiny demanded it, but because they chose to honor it. Elena watched as he departed, the horizon stretching open before her, and she understood that the future was no longer something that happened to her. It was something she stepped into with intention. The bond within her remained, not as a chain or a question, but as a quiet affirmation, and as Elena Hart turned back toward the path ahead, she knew that the law might hesitate, tradition might resist, but destiny, once claimed, did not ask permission to endure.